The scream cut through the night, before Wren even opened her eyes. She sat up on her narrow bed, heart slamming against her ribs, and for one terrible second, she thought the sound had come from inside her own house. Then it came again, farther away this time, carried on the wind that rolled down from the northern ridge. A wolf's cry, not a howl of celebration or a call between packmates. This was pain. Wren swung her legs off the bed and pressed her bare feet to the cold floor. The healing house where she worked kept her trained to listen for sounds like this, sounds that meant someone needed help before they even knew they needed it. But she was not on duty tonight. Tonight she was only a woman, alone in a small house at the edge of Blackthorn territory, the kind of house nobody visited unless they had to. She crossed to the window and pulled back the thin curtain. Moonlight spilled over the yard, silver and sharp, turning the grass to a sheet of frost that wasn't really there. Nothing moved, no shapes in the trees, no eyes catching the light. And yet her skin prickled the way it always did when something unseen was close. She told herself it was nothing. Wolves cried out during training exercises all the time. The enforcers pushed young fighters hard near the border, and pain was part of how a body learned its limits. She had bandaged enough proud young wolves to know that particular scream by heart. But this scream had not sounded young. It had sounded like something enormous, something that did not cry out easily, had been forced to. Wren let the curtain fall and climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket to her chin. Sleep did not come quickly. When it finally did, she dreamed of gold eyes watching her from the tree line, patient and unblinking, as if they had been watching her for a very long time, and had all the time in the world to keep doing it. She woke to sunlight and the smell of damp earth drifting through her open window. For a moment she lay still, letting the ordinary sounds of morning settle her. Birds arguing in the elm tree, someone's cartwheels creaking on the road half a mile off. The night's fear already felt foolish, the kind of thing that made sense at midnight and dissolved by breakfast. Then she noticed the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable to a nose trained by years of working around packmates. Wolf. Not the sharp, sour smell of an animal in distress, not the copper tang of injury. This was warm and clean, like sun-heated fur, like something that had been resting rather than running. It clung to the wood of her front porch, the way a person's perfume clings to a chair they have sat in for hours. Wren pulled on a robe and opened her front door carefully, half expecting to find an animal curled there, waiting for her. Instead, she found only flattened grass just beyond the step, a wide oval patch pressed down as if something large had lain there through the night, and then risen and gone. The dew around the patch had not been disturbed. Whatever had rested there had left before the sun rose high enough to wake the rest of the world. She crouched and pressed her palm to the flattened grass. It was warm. Not the sun's warmth. Nothing had touched that patch of ground except shade until now. This warmth came from something that had only just left, something that had been here mere minutes before she opened her door. Wren straightened quickly and looked out at the trees, scanning the shadows the way she scanned a patient's face for signs of fever. She saw nothing. No golden eyes, no dark shape slipping between trunks. Only the ordinary green quiet of a forest morning, birds calling, leaves shifting in a breeze too light to explain the cold that ran down her spine. She was an Omega. She knew what that meant in the eyes of most of the pack, though it took years to stop flinching from the word. It meant she ranked at the bottom of Blackthorn's order, the kind of wolf who healed hurts instead of causing them, whose voice mattered less in gatherings, whose company most higher-ranked wolves avoided out of habit rather than dislike. Nobody watched her doorstep. Nobody bothered. So why would something have rested here, patient and quiet, through the darkest hours of the night? She told herself it meant nothing. Perhaps a stray wolf from a neighboring territory had simply chosen her yard by accident, drawn by nothing more meaningful than shade or shelter from the wind. She had patients to see, and bandages to change, and a healing house that opened its doors in less than an hour. There was no room in her morning for mysteries that led nowhere. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back, and set off down the path toward the village center, refusing to look over her shoulder more than twice. She did not know that 100 miles east, in a stone hall lit by torches that never seemed to warm the air enough, a king had woken, with grass still clinging faintly to the underside of his claws, and no memory at all of choosing to run so far from home. Cale Ashwood stood at the window of his private chamber, arms crossed, staring down at a courtyard he had crossed 1,000 times without ever really seeing it. This morning he saw every stone, every shadow, because looking at anything close kept him from admitting where his mind kept drifting. He had woken an hour before dawn in his own bed, which should have been unremarkable except that he distinctly remembered falling asleep in his study the night before, papers spread across his desk, a candle burning low. Somewhere in the hours between, his body had moved without his permission. His wolf had taken control while his human mind slept, run somewhere, done something, and returned him to his bed as if nothing unusual had happened at all. This had happened 4 times in the last 3 weeks. He flexed his hand and studied his knuckles, half expecting to find some mark, some proof of what his wolf had been doing while he slept. There was nothing. No scent lingered on his skin that he could identify as belonging to a fight or a hunt. Just the faint green smell of grass and pine, and underneath it, something else. Something soft, something that made his chest tighten in a way he did not have a word for, and did not want to examine too closely. A knock sounded at his door. "Enter," Cale said, and turned from the window as if he had been doing something productive all along. Elias stepped inside, a stack of parchment tucked under one arm, and a look on his face that Cale had come to recognize as the particular expression his oldest friend wore when he was about to say something Cale would not enjoy hearing. Elias had served as his advisor since they were both young enough to still believe rank was something you earned through friendship rather than blood, and in all that time, Elias had never once learned how to soften bad news. "You look like a man who didn't sleep," Elias said, setting the parchment on the desk. "I slept fine." "You always say that. It's never true." Elias studied him a moment longer, head tilted, the way he used to study opponents before a spar. "Callum tells me your window was open again this morning. 2nd floor, no ladder, nothing broken. He's starting to think you have wings." Cale kept his expression flat. "I like fresh air." "You like fresh air at 3 in the morning, apparently. Badly enough to leave through a window instead of a door." Elias crossed his arms, mirroring Cale's own posture from a moment ago. "Cale, I've known you since we were pups fighting over the same stick. I know when you're hiding something from me. I'm not hiding anything. The lie came easily, the way lies always did when a man had practiced them enough times to believe them himself. My wolf has been restless, that's all. Kings don't sleep as soundly as other men. There's always something pulling at the edges of the mind." It was not entirely untrue. Cale had ruled Ashwood for 6 years, since his father's death had placed the weight of the crown on shoulders that had not yet finished growing into it. Restlessness was nothing new. Every alpha carried some version of it, a low hum of responsibility that never fully quieted even in sleep. But this was different. This felt less like the weight of a kingdom, and more like a pull, sharp and specific, aimed at one direction, and one direction only, north and west, toward Blackthorn territory. He had told himself for 3 weeks that it meant nothing, that his wolf was simply drawn to the border, the way any alpha's instincts might drift toward the edges of his influence, checking for threats, testing the boundaries of his territory the way a man checks that his doors are locked before bed. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, he suspected, a lie he was telling himself as carefully as the one he had just told Elias. "There's been talk of unrest near the Thorncastle border," Elias said, moving to more official business, though his eyes stayed on Cale a beat longer than necessary, as if he were leaving the door open for a truer answer. "Silas has been making noise about disputed hunting ground again. If your wolf wants somewhere to be restless about, that would be the sensible direction. I'll look into it," Cale said, and meant it, grateful for a reason to speak of anything other than the pull he could still feel now. Faint, but constant, like a string tied around his ribs, and drawn taut toward somewhere he had never visited and could not explain. Elias left him with the parchment and a warning to eat something before midday, and Cale was alone again, with the window and the courtyard, and the thought he kept trying to outrun. He had never been to Blackthorn territory. He had heard of it, of course. A smaller pack tucked along the northern edge of Ashwood's border, respected for its healers and its quiet loyalty, never troublesome enough to draw a king's direct attention. He could not name a single wolf who lived there. He had certainly never met anyone worth losing sleep over. And yet something in him, something buried deep beneath rank and duty, and the careful control he had spent 6 years perfecting, knew with absolute certainty that somewhere within that territory was a doorstep his wolf had chosen, out of every doorstep in every territory for 100 miles, to rest against through the darkest hours of the night. He did not understand it. He was not sure he wanted to, but some quiet, honest part of him, the part he kept locked away even from Elias, already suspected that whatever pulled him north was not going to let go simply because he refused to look at it directly. Wren spent the morning at the healing house, wrapping a sprained wrist and mixing a tincture for an elderly wolf's aching joints, grateful for the routine of it, the way work always managed to crowd out worry if she let it. Grace, the woman who ran the healing house and had trained Wren since she was young enough to be more trouble than help, noticed the distraction anyway. "You've rewrapped that bandage 3 times, Grace said without looking up from the herbs she was sorting. "It was fine the first time." "Sorry." Wren tied off the linen and stepped back. "I didn't sleep well." "Bad dreams?" "Something like that." Wren hesitated, then decided there was no harm in saying it aloud, if only to hear how foolish it sounded outside her own head. "I think something was on my porch last night." "An animal. The grass was flattened this morning, like something big had been lying there." Grace's hands paused over the herbs for just a moment before continuing. "Deer, probably. They wander close to houses when the weather turns." It smelled like wolf. That got Grace's attention properly. She set down the bundle of dried mint she'd been sorting and turned to face Wren fully, her expression unreadable in the way that older, more experienced wolves sometimes managed, giving nothing away until they had decided what was worth reacting to. "Did you see it?" "No, just the marks it left. And the smell." Wren shrugged, trying to make it sound smaller than it had felt at dawn. "It's probably nothing. A stray from another territory looking for shelter." "Probably," Grace agreed, though something in her tone suggested she did not fully believe it either. "Still, keep your door barred tonight, just to be careful. And Wren." She waited until Wren met her eyes. "If it happens again, tell someone. Don't sit on it because you think it isn't important enough to mention. You matter as much as anyone else in this pack, whatever your rank says." It was kindly meant, and Wren appreciated it, even as a small, tired part of her doubted it. She had spent long enough as an Omega to know that most of the pack did not share Grace's view, that most higher-ranked wolves walked past her without truly seeing her, the way people walk past furniture they have grown so used to they no longer register its presence. It was not cruelty exactly. It was simply how things were arranged, and she had long since stopped expecting it to change. Still, she promised Grace she would bar her door, and meant it, and told herself the strange warmth on her porch had nothing to do with her at all. She almost believed it, until she walked home that evening and found, tucked just beneath the edge of her doorstep where the light did not quite reach, a single wildflower, purple and small, its stem still damp as though it had been picked only moments before, and placed there with careful, deliberate hands, or paws. Wren stood staring at it for a long time before she finally bent down and picked it up, turning it over in her fingers, searching for some explanation that made sense. There was none. Wolves did not leave flowers. It was not something their instincts understood, not something their claws were built to manage with any gentleness. And yet here it was, small and purple and impossibly deliberate, resting exactly where something warm and unseen had chosen to rest the night before. She carried it inside and set it in a small cup of water on her windowsill, and told herself, one more time, that it meant nothing at all. She did not sleep easily that night either, but this time, when she woke near midnight to the faint, warm scent drifting through her window, she did not reach for fear first. She reached, instead, for something far more dangerous: curiosity. She rose from her bed, crossed to the window, and pressed her palm flat against the cool glass, searching the darkness beyond for any shape, any shadow, any sign of whatever had chosen her small, forgotten doorstep out of every doorstep in the world. The yard was empty, but the warmth in the air told her it had not been empty for long, and somewhere beneath the layers of caution she had built over years of being overlooked, a small and reckless hope began, quietly, to take root. Whatever was watching her, whatever had rested outside her door 2 nights running and left a flower behind like an apology or an offering, it had chosen her, not because rank demanded it, not because duty required it. It had chosen her simply because it wanted to. And though she could not have explained why, that thought frightened her far less than it should have. Callum found him in the training yard before sunrise, throwing punches at nothing, sweat soaking through his shirt, though the morning air was cold enough to fog his breath. "You've been out here an hour," Callum said, leaning against the fence post with the easy confidence of a man who had served as Cale's second since before either of them held their current ranks. "Elias sent me to check you hadn't broken your own hand on a post." "I'm fine." Cale dropped his fists and rolled his shoulders, working out a tension that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the pull still tugging at his chest. Quieter in daylight, but never fully gone. Needed to burn off something. Burn off what exactly? Callum's tone stayed light, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You've been like this for weeks, restless, distracted, waking up in places you didn't fall asleep. Half the guard thinks you're being hunted by something. The other half thinks you're hunting something yourself, and won't say what." Cale said nothing, which was answer enough for a man who had known him long enough to read silence as clearly as speech. "It's a woman, isn't it?" Callum said, not quite a question. "I don't know what it is." The admission surprised Cale even as he made it, the first honest thing he had said aloud in weeks. "My wolf keeps pulling toward Blackthorn territory. Every night. I don't choose it. I wake up, and I'm already gone. And by the time I come back to myself, I'm halfway there, or halfway home. And I don't remember deciding any of it." Callum straightened, the teasing gone from his posture now. "That's not restlessness, Cale. That's a bond. I've never been to Blackthorn. I've never met a single wolf who lives there." Cale shook his head, frustration sharpening his voice. "A bond needs two people. It needs contact, recognition, something. I can't have a bond with someone I've never seen." "You don't choose a mate bond, and you definitely don't need to remember meeting someone for your wolf to recognize them," Callum said. "Scent carries farther than memory does sometimes. If your wolf caught something on the wind once, even in passing, it wouldn't need your permission to go looking for the source again. It would just go." Cale turned away, staring toward the north, toward the direction his body had been dragging him for weeks without his consent. The idea settled into him slowly, uncomfortable, and impossible to dismiss now that it had been said aloud. A bond. Not chosen, not consented to, simply arrived. The way weather arrives. The way seasons turn, whether or not anyone asks them to. "If it's true," Cale said slowly, "then whoever it is, they're an Omega, or a low-ranked wolf in Blackthorn's structure. A pack that small. If there were a wolf of any real standing unmated, I'd have heard of her by now. Alliances get built on less." "Would that matter to you?" Callum asked, and there was something careful in the question, the kind of care a friend uses when he already suspects the answer will complicate things. Cale did not answer right away. He thought of the crown resting on his desk, of the advisors who would gather at any hint of a royal bond, and immediately begin calculating what it meant for alliances, trade routes, and standing among the other kingdoms. He thought of the expectations that had followed him since his father's death, the unspoken assumption that when Cale finally took a mate, it would be a wolf of high rank, chosen as much for the strength she brought to the kingdom as for anything his heart might want. An Omega from a small pack that mattered to no one, strategically, would satisfy none of those expectations. It would, in fact, be seen by half his council as a liability. "It shouldn't matter," Cale said finally, which was not quite an answer to what Callum had asked. "A king doesn't get to choose his mate based on feeling alone. There's too much riding on the decision." "Tell that to your wolf," Callum said dryly. "He doesn't seem to have gotten the message." Cale did not have a response for that, because it was true, and because some quiet part of him, the part that had spent 6 years being nothing but dutiful, had begun to wonder what it might feel like to want something without immediately calculating its cost. That night, he told himself he would not go. He sat at his desk with the border reports Elias had left him, forced his eyes across the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a word of it, and reminded himself with increasing firmness that a king who could not control his own wolf had no business ruling anyone. He fell asleep in the chair sometime past midnight, the candle burned down to a stub beside him. He woke on soft grass, cold night air on his fur, the shape of a small house rising in front of him, with a single window lit gold against the darkness. His wolf had already made the choice for him, the way it always seemed to now, and by the time Cale's human mind caught up enough to protest, he was already lying in the flattened patch of grass just beyond her doorstep, watching the light in her window flicker as she moved past it, unaware. He should have left. Every instinct of duty told him to rise, to turn, to run the long miles back to his own bed before dawn exposed him. Instead he stayed, some new and stubborn part of his wolf refusing to move, content simply to be near enough to catch her scent on the wind, warm and clean, like herbs in rainwater. He watched the window until the light went out, until the house settled into the particular stillness of a home where someone slept peacefully, unaware of the king curled just beyond her door, like some silent, self-appointed guard. Guard duty, he told himself, and almost believed it. A king protects what belongs to his territory, whether or not the ones inside know they are being protected. It did not matter that Blackthorn was not, strictly speaking, his territory. It did not matter that no threat had been reported. No danger lurked in these quiet woods worth a king's personal attention. He told himself the lie anyway, because the truth, that his wolf had simply chosen her, without reason, without permission, without any regard for crowns or councils or the careful order he had built his whole life around, was too large to hold in the dark without flinching. Before dawn broke fully, he rose, stretched muscles stiff from the cold, and paused at the edge of her yard. Something small and purple grew wild along the fence line, and without quite deciding to, he found himself lowering his head, closing gentle jaws around the stem, and carrying it to her doorstep before he turned and ran the long miles home, arriving just as the sky began to lighten, slipping through his window and back into his bed as though he had never left it at all. Elias found him at breakfast, eyes shadowed with exhaustion he made no effort to hide. "You went again," Elias said. It was not a question. "I did." "And?" Cale turned his cup slowly in his hands, watching the surface of his tea ripple. "I don't know her name. I've never spoken to her. I don't even know if she's seen me, not truly, not as anything more than shadows on her porch." He looked up, and something in his expression must have given away more than he intended, because Elias's teasing manner faded into something gentler, more serious. "But I can't stop, Elias. I've tried. My wolf won't let me." "Then maybe it's time you stopped trying to stop it," Elias said quietly, and started figuring out what it actually wants instead. Cale did not answer, but the words settled into him and stayed there through the rest of the day, through council meetings he barely followed, and reports he signed without reading closely enough. Somewhere north and west, in a small house at the edge of a pack that had never drawn a king's attention before, a woman was waking to find a second flower on her doorstep, and though neither of them yet understood what was forming between them, something had already begun that neither duty nor distance would be able to fully undo. The second flower sat beside the first in the small cup on Wren's windowsill, and by the fifth morning there were 5, a small crooked bouquet that had no business existing and yet did, undeniable proof that whatever visited her doorstep each night was not a stray animal looking for shelter, but something with intention, something with hands, or paws, or whatever strange combination of both a shifted wolf possessed when it chose to be gentle. She had stopped being afraid somewhere around the third flower. Fear had given way, slowly, and without her quite noticing the shift, to a kind of quiet fascination she did not fully trust, and could not seem to shake either. She found herself listening for the particular hush that settled over the yard each night, when something large and careful lowered itself into the grass beyond her door. She found herself lingering by the window before bed, not out of fear now, but out of something closer to anticipation, though she would not have admitted that word aloud to anyone, least of all herself. She had not told Grace about the flowers. She was not entirely sure why. Perhaps because saying it aloud would make it real in a way she was not ready for, would turn a private, strange, wordless comfort into something the pack would want explained, categorized, made sense of according to rules Wren had spent her whole life on the losing end of. Nora noticed anyway, because Nora noticed everything, and had been Wren's closest friend since they were girls too young to understand why some wolves were treated as though they mattered less than others. "You've been smiling at nothing all week," Nora said, dropping onto the bench beside Wren outside the healing house, a basket of bread balanced on one hip. "It's unsettling. What happened?" "Nothing happened." Wren kept her eyes on the herbs she was sorting, though her mouth had, admittedly, curved without her permission at the thought of the flowers waiting for her at home. "Wren, Nora's voice carried the particular patience of someone who had extracted secrets from Ren before, and fully intended to do it again. "I've known you since we were 6. You don't get that look over nothing." Ren hesitated, then relented, because keeping it entirely to herself had started to feel less like privacy and more like loneliness, and she had carried enough of that in her life already. She told Nora about the flattened grass, the warm scent, the flowers appearing one by one on her doorstep, with no explanation and no witness, and watched her friend's expression shift from curiosity to something far more serious by the time she finished. "That's not a stray animal, Ren," Nora said slowly. "Strays don't leave gifts. That's a wolf. A specific wolf, choosing you specifically, night after night." She paused, thinking, "Has anyone new come through Blackthorn recently? A visitor, a trader, anyone from another territory?" "Not that I know of." "Then it's someone from here." Nora's eyes narrowed with the particular focus she brought to solving problems, a trait that had made her useful in 100 smaller crises over the years. Someone who already knows where you live, someone careful enough not to be seen, which means someone who has a reason to hide. The thought unsettled Ren more than she wanted to admit. She had assumed, in the vague, half-formed way a person assumes things they would rather not examine too closely, that whoever visited her was simply shy, or private, or uncertain how to approach her directly. The idea that they might instead have a reason to hide, a reason significant enough to require secrecy, sat differently in her chest. "Do you think it could be dangerous?" she asked. Nora considered this carefully before answering, because she was not the type to offer comfort she didn't believe. "I don't think danger leaves flowers," she said finally, "but I do think you should be careful all the same. Not everyone who cares about someone does it for reasons that are good for that someone. Watch. Don't confront it alone. And if it ever feels wrong, even a little, come find me immediately." Ren promised she would, and meant it, though some stubborn, curious part of her had already decided that whatever waited beyond her door each night did not feel dangerous. It felt, if anything, cautious, in a way that suggested care rather than threat, the careful, deliberate distance of something that wanted to be close, but did not yet trust itself, or perhaps her, enough to close that distance fully. That evening, walking home from the healing house, she took a different path than usual, one that curved wide around the edge of the training grounds, where Blackthorn's enforcers ran drills most afternoons. She told herself it was simply a change of scenery, nothing more, though the truth was closer to curiosity than she wanted to acknowledge, a small hope that she might catch some glimpse of anything unusual, any visitor to the pack whose presence might explain what had been happening at her door. She saw nothing out of place. Enforcers sparred in pairs, dust rising around their boots, Ivy among them, sharp-eyed and quick, calling corrections to a younger fighter, with the particular impatience she brought to everything. Ren had never been close with Ivy, who ranked high enough in the pack structure to have little reason to notice an Omega healer, but she had always respected the woman's competence, the way she moved through the world with total certainty about her place in it. Ivy noticed her watching, and broke from the drill, jogging over with the easy confidence of someone entirely comfortable in her own strength. "You're off your usual path," Ivy said, not unkindly, though her sharp eyes assessed Ren with the quick, evaluating look she gave everyone, friend or stranger. "Everything all right at the healing house?" "Fine, just needed the walk." Ren offered a small smile, unwilling to explain the real reason, unsure how to explain it even to herself. "You all look busy." "Border patrols have doubled. Something's been running through the northern woods at night, moving fast, covering more ground than any local wolf has business covering. We've found tracks 3 mornings running, always heading the same direction, toward the ridge and back out again before dawn." Ivy's brow furrowed slightly. "Big tracks. Bigger than anyone in Blackthorn, honestly. We're starting to think it might be someone from outside our territory." Ren's stomach tightened, a cold, sudden understanding settling over her before she had fully worked out why. Big tracks. A wolf that ran fast enough to cover significant distance and return before dawn. A visitor, careful enough to leave no trace of its identity behind. "Do you think it's dangerous?" she asked, echoing the question she had asked Nora only hours before, though her voice came out steadier than she expected, given how quickly her thoughts were racing. "Hard to say. It hasn't threatened anyone, hasn't taken livestock, hasn't crossed into the village itself as far as we can tell." Ivy shrugged, though her posture stayed alert, the wariness of someone who took her duty seriously, even when the threat remained undefined. But a stranger running our woods at night, without announcing themselves, that's not nothing. We'll find out who it is eventually. Whoever it is, isn't as careful as they think. Wren said nothing further, thanked Ivy for the update, and continued home with her thoughts churning far faster than her steady pace suggested. She understood now, with a clarity that made her chest tight, that the visitor at her door was not simply shy or careless with boundaries. The visitor was someone significant enough, someone with enough at stake, that they had gone to considerable lengths to avoid being identified, running unfamiliar territory under cover of darkness, careful enough to leave almost no trace behind except the evidence Wren herself had noticed by accident. Whoever it was, they were hiding from something far larger than simple shyness, and the tracks, if Ivy's assessment was accurate, belonged to a wolf larger than anyone local, a wolf whose size alone suggested rank, strength, standing. That night, Wren did not wait by her window, out of vague, unexamined anticipation. She waited with purpose, determined finally to see, clearly and without doubt, exactly who or what had been choosing her doorstep, night after night, for reasons she was only beginning to understand, carried far more weight than she had first assumed. She did not have long to wait. Near midnight, the familiar hush fell over her yard, the particular stillness that meant something large had arrived and settled, quiet and careful, into the grass beyond her door. Wren rose from where she had been sitting by the window, crossed to her front door, with her heart hammering hard enough to feel in her throat, and, before caution could talk her out of it, pulled the door open and stepped outside. The wolf that lay curled in her yard raised its head instantly, gold eyes catching the moonlight, enormous and unmistakably powerful, a size and presence that confirmed everything Ivy's report had suggested and more. For one long, breathless moment, neither of them moved, Wren standing frozen on her own doorstep, the wolf watching her with an intensity that felt, impossibly, like recognition. Then, before she could speak, before she could ask any of the 100 questions crowding her throat, the wolf rose in one fluid motion and vanished into the tree line, faster than anything she had ever seen move, leaving nothing behind but flattened grass and the fading warmth of a presence that had chosen, once again, to disappear rather than be known. Cale ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out beneath him, and even then he did not stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing exactly how badly he had handled the moment that had just happened. She had seen him, fully, clearly, standing in her own doorway with the moonlight catching her face, and he had done the only thing his instincts could manage in that instant of pure exposed panic. He had run. He did not shift back to human form until he was well within Ashwood's borders, collapsing against a tree with his human legs shaking beneath him, breath ragged, his mind replaying the image over and over. Her eyes had gone wide, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of stunned recognition that had hit him harder than any blow he'd taken in the training yard in years. She had not screamed. She had not run inside and barred the door. She had simply stood there, watching him, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment without fully realizing it. And he had fled like a coward. He dressed in the clothes he'd left folded at the base of the tree, a habit born of careful planning from those first nights, when he'd still believed he could control where his wolf carried him, and began the long walk back toward the castle, his mind a chaotic tangle of thoughts he could not organize into any useful order. She would tell someone. Of course she would. A stranger, enormous and unfamiliar, discovered lurking outside her home night after night. Finally seen clearly, of course she would report it to whoever in Blackthorn handled such things. And once word spread of a wolf that size, running that far, that fast, someone would eventually connect the size, the direction, the pattern, to Ashwood's border, to Cale himself, and the careful secrecy he had maintained for weeks would collapse entirely. He should have been more troubled by that possibility than he was. Instead, walking alone, through the pale gray light before dawn, what occupied his mind most was not the political disaster that might follow exposure, but the memory of her face, caught between shock and something gentler, something that had looked, for one impossible moment, like relief. Elias was waiting when Cale finally reached the castle, seated on the front steps with 2 cups of tea steaming faintly in the cold morning air, an expression that suggested he had been waiting for some time and had already guessed a good portion of what had happened. You look like a man who's been caught, Elias said, offering one of the cups as Cale climbed the steps. I have been. Cale accepted the tea, without really registering the warmth of it, his mind still miles away, replaying the moment on the doorstep. She saw me, Elias, clearly. Human eyes, full moonlight, no mistaking it. Elias set down his own cup slowly, his teasing manner dropping away in the face of Cale's evident distress. And what did you do? I ran. Cale. I know. Cale dropped onto the step beside his friend, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. I know how it looks. A grown man, a king, fleeing from a woman standing on her own doorstep, instead of simply saying something, anything, to explain himself. But I didn't know what to say. I don't even know her name, Elias. I've never spoken a single word to her, and yet apparently my wolf decided weeks ago that she mattered more than anyone I've actually met, and now she's seen me, and I have no idea what happens next. Elias was quiet for a long moment, considering, before he spoke again, his voice gentler than his usual dry humor allowed. What happens next is that you go back, properly, this time, not as a wolf slinking through the dark like something ashamed of itself, but as a man, in daylight, with an actual introduction, and an actual apology for weeks of frightening a woman who had every right to feel unsettled by strange tracks outside her home. And if she reports it? If Blackthorn's enforcers are already searching for whoever left those tracks, and I walk in and announce myself as the wolf they've been hunting for? Then you'll have to trust that a king apologizing honestly carries more weight than a stranger caught sneaking around in the dark, Elias said. You cannot keep doing this halfway, Cale. Either you accept what your wolf has already decided and act like the man you actually are, or you cut it off entirely and find a way to stop the pull for good. But the middle path, showing up at night and vanishing at the first sign of being seen, that's not fair to her, and honestly, it isn't fair to you either. Cale knew his friend was right, had known it even before Elias said it aloud, but knowing a thing and finding the courage to act on it were, he was quickly learning, two entirely different challenges. He thought of the crown, waiting for him in the council chamber, of the alliances his advisors would expect him to weigh, before making any decision of consequence, of how impossibly complicated it would become, the moment anyone learned that Ashwood's king had formed an unchosen bond with an Omega healer, from a pack too small to matter strategically. And then he thought of her face in the doorway, caught between shock and something that had looked, for the briefest moment, like she recognized him too, though they had never properly met at all. I'll go, he said finally, properly this time, in daylight. Good. Elias picked his tea back up, satisfied, though his eyes stayed thoughtful. There's actually a reason for you to visit Blackthorn regardless, if you want one that doesn't require explaining yourself to the council just yet. Their pack leader sent word last week requesting additional support for the border patrols, given the unrest near Thorn Castle. A formal visit to discuss increased cooperation would raise no eyebrows at all. Cale felt something loosen slightly in his chest at the excuse, grateful for the cover it offered, even as some more honest part of him recognized that he would have found a reason to go regardless, cover story or not. Arrange it, he said, as soon as possible. 3 days later, Cale rode into Blackthorn territory at the head of a small formal party, Elias and Callum flanking him, banners bearing Ashwood's colors catching the wind, as they approached the modest gathering hall at the center of the pack's settlement. Word of a royal visit had clearly traveled ahead of them, because a small crowd had already gathered, curious and murmuring, and among them, near the back, Cale caught sight of copper hair and a familiar face gone pale with what could only be recognition. Ren stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, staring at the king dismounting from his horse with a composure that gave away nothing of the wolf who had fled her doorstep only days before, and yet she recognized him instantly. The same gold eyes, the same enormous, careful presence, now dressed in fine, formal clothing, and greeted with the deference owed to a ruler rather than the wariness owed to a trespasser. The King of Ashwood, she thought, her mind reeling as the pieces fell abruptly into place. The wolf who had rested on her doorstep, who had left her flowers, who had watched her with such quiet intensity before vanishing into the trees, was not some anonymous stranger or restless local wolf. He was Cale Ashwood, ruler of a kingdom that dwarfed her own small pack entirely, and he was walking now through Blackthorn's gathering hall, as though nothing at all connected him to the frightened, wide-eyed woman standing at the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met across the distance, just for a moment, and something passed between them that Wren could not have named even if she'd tried, an acknowledgement neither of them dared speak aloud in front of so many watching eyes. Cale's expression remained perfectly composed, the picture of formal restraint, but his gaze held hers a fraction too long, long enough that Ivy, standing near Wren, noticed and raised an eyebrow in silent question. Wren looked away first, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain half the crowd could hear it, and did not know, could not have known yet, that the careful, controlled distance both of them were trying so hard to maintain was already beginning to crack, and neither of them would be able to hold it together for very much longer. The gathering hall smelled of wood smoke and roasted meat, tables pushed together for the feast Blackthorn's leader had ordered prepared in honor of the king's visit, and Wren stood near the back wall trying, without much success, to convince herself that she could simply avoid the King of Ashwood for the entire evening if she stayed far enough from the head table. She managed it for nearly an hour. Then Grace, of all people, ruined it entirely. "Wren, come here a moment," Grace called from near the head table, waving her over with the particular authority she used when she expected to be obeyed without question. "The healing house should be represented properly. King Cale was asking about our herb stores for his own healers, given the unrest near his southern border." Wren's stomach dropped, but there was no graceful way to refuse without drawing more attention than simply complying would, so she crossed the hall on legs that felt far less steady than she wanted them to be, and found herself standing, moments later, directly in front of the man whose wolf had rested on her doorstep only days before, close enough now to see that his eyes really were the exact same gold, unmistakable even in human form. "Your Majesty," Grace said, "this is Wren, one of our finest healers. She trained under me for years, and has taken over most of the difficult cases herself." "Wren," Cale repeated her name slowly, as though testing the shape of it, and something in his expression flickered, brief and unguarded, before the composed royal mask settled back into place. "It's a pleasure to meet you properly." The word properly landed between them, with a weight only the two of them understood, and Wren felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite every effort to remain composed in front of her mentor and half the gathered pack. "The pleasure is mine, Your Majesty," she managed, and was faintly proud of how steady her voice came out. Grace, sensing nothing unusual in the exchange, launched immediately into a detailed discussion of herb varieties and preservation techniques, and Wren found herself grateful for the older woman's enthusiasm, which carried the conversation forward without requiring much from Wren beyond the occasional nod or clarifying detail. Cale, for his part, listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions about dosages and growing seasons that suggested either real interest or an impressive gift for appearing interested, and Wren found herself, despite everything, gradually relaxing into the familiar rhythm of discussing her work. It was easier, somehow, to talk about herbs and healing than to acknowledge the enormous, unspoken truth sitting between them. And yet, several times throughout the conversation, Cale's eyes would drift to hers for a beat too long, and something would pass between them, quiet and charged, before he caught himself and returned his attention to whatever Grace was explaining. Eventually Grace excused herself to attend to another guest, leaving Wren and Cale alone at the edge of the crowded hall for the first time, the noise of the feast providing a strange kind of privacy in plain sight. "You saw me," Cale said quietly, once Grace was safely out of earshot. "3 nights ago, on your doorstep." Wren's breath caught, though some part of her had known this conversation was coming from the moment she'd recognized him across the crowd. "I did. I owe you an explanation, and an apology." He glanced around briefly, confirming no one stood close enough to overhear, before continuing, his voice low. "I don't fully understand it myself, if I'm honest. My wolf has been pulling toward your home for weeks now, since before I even knew your territory existed, let alone your name. I've tried to stop it. I haven't managed." "The flowers," Wren said, the pieces finally clicking fully into place. "That was you." Something almost like embarrassment crossed his face, an expression that looked strange and endearing on someone so composed and formal in every other respect. "My wolf's idea, mostly. I'm not entirely sure what he intended by it. I don't think he fully understands human gestures, if I'm honest. only that something in him wanted you to know he'd been there, without frightening you. It worked, mostly, Ren said, a small smile tugging at her mouth despite the strangeness of the entire situation. I wasn't frightened. Confused, certainly, but not frightened. I'm glad. Kale's expression softened, and for a moment, the careful, controlled king seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by something younger and more uncertain. I don't know what this is, between us. I don't have a name for it that makes sense, given that we've never properly spoken before tonight, but I know I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the very first night my wolf found your doorstep, and I know running from you 3 nights ago was cowardly, and I'd like the chance to be braver about it, if you're willing to give me that chance. Ren studied him for a long moment, weighing the strangeness of the situation against the quiet honesty in his voice, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him entirely. I think, she said slowly, that I'd like that too, though I should warn you, Your Majesty, that an Omega healer from a small pack makes for an unusual choice for a king's attention. I imagine your council will have opinions about that. Let them have opinions, Kale said, and something fierce and certain settled into his expression, the first glimpse Ren had seen of the confidence that must have made him a formidable ruler. I've spent 6 years making decisions for the sake of alliances and expectations. I'd like, just once, to make one for myself instead. Across the hall, unnoticed by either of them in the charged privacy of their conversation, Ivy watched the exchange with narrowed, calculating eyes, taking careful note of how close the king stood to an Omega healer, how his attention never fully strayed from her even while other guests attempted to draw him into conversation, how something unspoken and significant seemed to pass between them again and again throughout the evening. Ivy said nothing to anyone that night, but she filed the observation away carefully, the way she filed away every piece of information that might one day prove useful, and did not yet know that the tracks she and the other enforcers had been hunting through the northern woods for weeks belonged to the very king now standing in Blackthorn's gathering hall, close enough to touch the woman he had been secretly watching over all along. Ivy waited until 3 days after the king's formal visit had ended before she brought her findings to Blackthorn's pack leader, wanting to be certain of what she'd pieced together before raising an alarm that might prove embarrassing if wrong. But the tracks matched too precisely to ignore. The size, the gait, the direction, all of it lined up exactly with the pattern the border patrols had been tracking through the northern woods for weeks, and all of it pointed, unmistakably, toward the same modest house at the edge of the territory that Ivy had noticed Kale Ashwood watching so intently at the feast. She brought her report first to Ren directly, some instinct telling her that whatever this was deserved a conversation before it became an official matter for the pack leader's attention. I need to ask you something, Ivy said, finding Ren alone at the healing house late one afternoon, sorting supplies with the particular focus she brought to tasks that let her avoid thinking too hard about anything else. And I need you to be honest with me, because if I'm right about this, it's bigger than either of us. Ren set down the jar she'd been holding, something in Ivy's tone immediately putting her on edge. All right? The tracks we've been finding near the border for the past month. Large, fast, always heading toward your house and back out again before dawn. Ivy watched her closely as she spoke. I think they belong to King Kale Ashwood, and I think you already know that. There was no point denying it, not to someone as sharp as Ivy, and Ren found she did not particularly want to try. Yes, she admitted quietly. I know. Ivy exhaled slowly, some tension leaving her shoulders that Ren hadn't realized was there. Then you understand why I have to bring this to the pack leader. A foreign king, even one from an allied kingdom, running unannounced through our territory at night. That's not a small thing, Ren, whatever his reasons. It's a matter of pack security. He wasn't a threat, Ren said quickly, an unexpected protectiveness rising in her chest at the thought of Kale being reported as some kind of danger. He never approached anyone but me, never touched anything, never caused harm. He was only, she hesitated, uncertain how to explain something she barely understood herself. He was only watching over me. I think his wolf recognized something in me before either of us understood what it meant. Understanding dawned slowly across Ivy's face, her sharp eyes widening slightly as the pieces reassembled themselves into a very different picture. A bond, she said. You're saying the King of Ashwood has formed a bond with you. I don't know what else to call it, Ren admitted. Neither does he, honestly. It happened without either of us choosing it. Ivy was quiet for a long moment, clearly recalculating everything she had planned to report, weighing the difference between a foreign threat and a foreign king, drawn by forces neither of them fully controlled. This changes things, she said finally. But it doesn't erase the fact that he was moving through our territory in secret, unannounced, for weeks. Whatever his reasons, that's not something Blackthorn's leader can simply overlook, especially once the connection to you becomes known, which it will, eventually. Word like this doesn't stay quiet for long. What happens now? Ren asked, dread settling low in her stomach at the thought of this private, fragile thing between herself and Kale becoming pack business, subject to scrutiny and judgment from people who understood none of the strange, quiet tenderness that had grown between them. Now I bring what I know to the pack leader, because that's my duty, and I won't apologize for doing it properly, Ivy said, not unkindly. But I'll make sure the full context comes with it, that he never threatened anyone. That this appears to be a genuine bond rather than some kind of trespass. She paused, studying Ren with an expression that had softened considerably from where the conversation began. For what it's worth, I don't think you have anything to be ashamed of. A bond isn't something either party chooses. If his wolf found you worth watching over all this time, that says something about you that rank never could. The words offered more comfort than Ren expected, and she thanked Ivy quietly before the enforcer left to make her report, though the dread did not fully leave her chest. She understood, with growing clarity, that whatever quiet, private thing had been growing between herself and Kale was about to become public in ways neither of them had prepared for, and that once it did, the careful, controlled world Kale had built as king would collide directly with the small, overlooked life she had built as an Omega healer, and there was no telling, yet, which one would bend to accommodate the other. Blackthorn's pack leader, a steady, thoughtful man named Owen who had led the pack through nearly 2 decades without significant conflict, called Ren to his hall the following morning, and though his manner remained calm and measured throughout their conversation, the seriousness of the situation was evident in every careful question he asked. I don't intend to punish you for something you didn't choose, Owen said, after Ren had explained, as honestly as she could manage, everything she understood about the bond forming between herself and Kale. But I need you to understand the position this puts our pack in. Ashwood is a significant kingdom, far larger and more powerful than Blackthorn. If word spreads that their king has formed a bond with one of our Omegas, every neighboring territory will have opinions about what that means, politically, strategically. Some will see it as an opportunity. Others may see it as a threat to be addressed before it solidifies further. I understand, Ren said, though the weight of his words settled uncomfortably in her chest, the sense that something private and personal was already being pulled apart and examined for its usefulness or danger to people who had never even considered her worth noticing before. I've sent word to King Kale, requesting a formal conversation, Owen continued. Whatever exists between the two of you, it can't continue in secret any longer. Not now that Ivy's report has confirmed what's been happening. Both our packs deserve clarity, and frankly, so do you. His expression softened slightly, some genuine sympathy showing through the careful diplomacy. This isn't a small thing you've found yourself caught in, Ren. I want you prepared for that, whatever comes of it. Ren left Owen's hall with her mind spinning, the private, tender secrecy that had defined her connection to Kale now fully unraveling into something far larger and more complicated than either of them had anticipated. And somewhere, she knew, word was already beginning to travel, carried by whispers and careful glances, toward every corner of Blackthorn, and, soon enough, toward Ashwood itself. The letter arrived at Ashwood's castle 3 days later, sealed with Blackthorn's simple wax mark, and Elias delivered it to Kale personally, watching his king's face carefully as he read through Owen's careful, diplomatic request for a formal conversation regarding, as the letter phrased it, matters of mutual concern between their two territories. They know, Kale said, setting the letter down slowly. Someone identified the tracks. It was always going to happen eventually, Elias said, not unkindly. You weren't exactly subtle, running the same path through their territory night after night for over a month. Kale pressed his palms against his eyes, exhaustion and something closer to relief mixing uncomfortably in his chest. Part of him had been dreading this moment, the collision of his careful, secret world with the demands of formal diplomacy and council scrutiny. But another part of him, a part he was only beginning to acknowledge honestly, felt something like relief at the idea that he would no longer need to sneak through the dark like a man ashamed of what he wanted. "I need to speak with the council before I respond," Cale said. "If Owen already knows, the council will know soon enough, and I'd rather they hear it from me than from rumor." The council convened within the hour. 7 advisors gathered around the long table in Ashwood's meeting chamber, and Cale watched their faces carefully as he explained, as plainly as he could manage, what had been happening over the past several weeks. He watched surprise cross some faces, calculation cross others, and on one advisor in particular, an older woman named Bianca, who had served on the council since before Cale's father's death, something that looked distinctly like disapproval. "A bond with an Omega," Bianca said, once Cale had finished, her tone carefully neutral, though the disapproval remained evident beneath it. "From Blackthorn, no less. A pack with no significant military strength, no valuable trade resources, nothing to offer this kingdom beyond herbs and healers. Your Majesty, I understand bonds are not chosen, but surely you understand what this means for Ashwood's standing among the other kingdoms. Alliances are built on strategic marriages. This offers us nothing." "It offers us honesty," Cale said, and was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded, despite the tightness in his chest. "I have spent 6 years, making every decision this crown required of me, with strategy and alliance in mind, and I do not regret that, because it was necessary. But a bond is not a decision I made, Bianca. It found me, whether or not it fits neatly into the calculations this council prefers. I don't intend to reject something real, simply because it fails to serve a strategic purpose. With respect, Your Majesty," another advisor cut in, a younger man named Hugo who had always been more cautious than bold. "The other kingdoms will see this as weakness. A king led by instinct rather than judgment, chasing after a low-ranked wolf from an insignificant pack instead of securing an alliance that strengthens our position. Silas of Thorncastle already tests our borders. If he perceives distraction, he will press harder." Cale felt the weight of their concerns settle over him, valid in their own way, the kind of practical, strategic thinking that had kept Ashwood stable and secure for generations. He could not simply dismiss it, however much he wanted to. A king's choices rippled outward, affecting far more than his own private happiness, and he understood, with a clarity that ached, that embracing this bond fully would carry real costs, costs that were not his alone to bear. "I hear your concerns," Cale said finally, "and I won't pretend they're baseless, but I need time to think through what this means, for the kingdom and for myself, before I respond to Blackthorn's request for a formal conversation. Give me that, at least." The council reluctantly agreed, though Bianca's disapproval lingered visibly as the meeting dispersed, and Cale retreated to his private chamber that evening, with the weight of the entire discussion pressing heavily on his chest. He understood, more clearly than he wanted to, the impossible position he now occupied, caught between a bond his wolf had chosen without his permission, and a crown that demanded decisions be made with far more calculation than his heart currently seemed capable of managing. He thought of Wren's face at the feast, the quiet strength in how she'd spoken of her work, the warmth that had settled in his chest simply from standing near her. He thought, too, of Bianca's words, of Hugo's warnings, of Silas testing the borders while Ashwood's king remained distracted by matters the council considered beneath his attention. For the first time since his wolf had first pulled him north toward Blackthorn, Cale found himself seriously questioning whether the bond, however real, however undeniable, was something he could actually afford to embrace. He did not sleep well that night, and when Elias found him at breakfast the next morning, hollow-eyed and quiet, his friend did not need to ask what troubled him. "You're thinking of pulling back," Elias said, not a question. "I don't know what I'm thinking," Cale admitted, staring into his untouched tea. "The council isn't wrong, Elias. There are real costs to this, costs that fall not just on me, but on everyone this crown is responsible for protecting. I can't simply ignore that, because my wolf has decided he wants something." "And what about Wren?" Elias asked quietly. "Does she deserve to be treated as something you can simply set aside once it becomes inconvenient?" The question landed hard, and Cale had no good answer for it, only the growing, uncomfortable understanding that whatever he decided in the coming days would shape not only his own future, but hers as well, and he was not at all certain he had the wisdom to choose correctly. Kale's reply reached Blackthorn 5 days later, and it was not the answer Wren had allowed herself to hope for. The letter, formal and carefully worded, requested that the matter under discussion be set aside for the time being, citing pressing concerns along Ashwood's southern border that required the king's full attention. There was no mention of the flowers, no mention of the doorstep, no mention of anything that had passed between them at the feast. Only careful, distant, diplomatic language that felt, to Wren, like a door closing softly but firmly. She read the letter twice, sitting alone in the healing house after everyone else had gone home for the evening, and told herself she was not surprised. She had known, from the very first moment she recognized him as a king, rather than a stray wolf, that whatever existed between them would eventually collide with the realities of his position. She had simply hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the collision would take longer to arrive, or that it might resolve differently than this. Grace found her still sitting there an hour later, the letter folded neatly in her lap, her expression carefully composed in the way Wren had learned, over years of being overlooked, to manage even when something inside her felt like it was quietly breaking. "You don't have to pretend with me," Grace said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "I heard about the letter. Owen mentioned it this morning." "It's fine," Wren said, and heard how unconvincing it sounded even as she said it. "I always knew this was unlikely to go anywhere. A king and an Omega healer. It was never a realistic match, whatever his wolf decided in the dark." "That's not what I asked," Grace said. "I asked if you were all right, not whether you'd found a sensible explanation for why you shouldn't be upset." Wren's composure cracked slightly at that, just enough for the tiredness and hurt to show through. "I don't know how to feel, honestly. Part of me wants to be angry with him for pulling back so easily, for choosing his council's opinions over whatever we might have built. But another part of me understands completely. He's a king, Grace. Everything he does affects an entire kingdom. I can't fault him for taking that seriously, even if it means I'm the one left standing here without an answer." "You're allowed to feel both things at once," Grace said. "Understanding someone's reasons doesn't mean you have to be all right with the outcome." She reached over and squeezed Wren's hand briefly, a rare gesture of open affection from a woman usually more comfortable expressing care through practical action than words. "Whatever happens with the king, you are not defined by whether he chooses to claim you, Wren. You were valuable before any of this began, and you'll remain valuable no matter how it ends. Don't let his hesitation convince you otherwise." The words helped, though not entirely, and over the following 2 weeks, Wren threw herself into her work at the healing house, with a focus that Grace recognized, correctly, as a way of avoiding feelings too large to sit with comfortably. She told herself, repeatedly, that she was moving forward, that she would not spend her life waiting on a doorstep for a man who had already made his choice clear through silence and careful diplomatic distance. She noticed, though she tried not to, that the flowers had stopped appearing. No warmth in the grass beyond her door, no small purple blooms left in careful, deliberate offering. The absence sat heavier in her chest than she wanted to admit, a quiet confirmation that whatever pull had drawn Kale to her doorstep night after night had, apparently, finally been overruled by the demands of his crown. What she did not know, could not have known, was that Kale's nights had not grown peaceful in the absence of those visits. If anything, they had grown worse. He lay awake for hours each night, his wolf restless and miserable beneath the surface of his carefully maintained composure, straining against the deliberate distance Kale had forced upon them both. He had told himself, repeatedly, that stepping back was the responsible choice, the choice a king owed his kingdom, regardless of what his own heart wanted. He had not expected how much the choice would cost him, how hollow his days had become, without the quiet anchor of knowing, even from a distance, that she was safe and well. Elias watched him grow increasingly withdrawn over those same 2 weeks, snapping at advisors who had never once earned his irritation before, sleeping poorly, eating less, until even Callum, usually content to let Kale manage his own moods, finally confronted him directly during a training session that had turned unusually aggressive. "You're going to hurt someone if you keep fighting like this," Callum said, catching Kale's wrist mid-swing and holding it firmly until Kale, breathing hard, finally stepped back. "This isn't training anymore. This is you punishing yourself for a decision you're clearly not at peace with." Cale said nothing, but his silence was answer enough, and Callum pressed further, unwilling to let the moment pass without saying what needed saying. "You made a choice you thought your kingdom needed," Callum said, "but look at yourself, Cale. You're miserable. Your wolf is miserable. Whatever the council's concerns, I don't think a king who can barely function is actually serving his kingdom well either. There has to be a better answer than simply cutting away the one thing that seemed to make you steady these past weeks." The words settled into Cale slowly over the following days, working against the careful walls he'd built around the decision, and though he did not yet know what path forward might satisfy both his crown's demands and his wolf's undeniable need, he began, for the first time since sending that careful, distant letter to Blackthorn, to seriously consider that pulling away entirely might not have been the wisdom he'd told himself it was. Neither Cale nor Wren knew, as they each sat with their own quiet grief in their separate territories, that events already moving along Ashwood's southern border would soon force the question neither of them had found the courage to resolve, and that the answer, when it finally came, would arrive not through careful diplomacy or council deliberation, but through danger that neither of them could have anticipated. The riders came at dusk, moving fast and quiet along the eastern tree line, and the first sign Blackthorn had of trouble was Ivy's sharp whistle cutting across the training grounds, the signal every enforcer had drilled into instinct for exactly this kind of moment. Silas of Thorncastle had grown bold in recent weeks, emboldened by reports, carried swiftly along the usual channels of gossip and rumor, that Ashwood's king had grown distracted, distant from his own council, distant from the small pack he had once visited with such evident interest. A distracted king meant a distracted alliance, and Silas, always hungry for advantage, had decided that Blackthorn, small and lightly defended, made an easier target for pressing his territorial claims than confronting Ashwood directly. His riders did not come for the whole pack, though. Word had reached Thorncastle, through channels Silas had cultivated carefully, of exactly which Omega healer had drawn the Ashwood king's private attention, and Silas understood, with the calculating cruelty of a man who saw people as tools rather than individuals, that striking at her would wound Cale far more precisely than any assault on Blackthorn's borders generally could manage. Wren was walking home from the healing house when Thorncastle's riders found her, 3 of them, moving fast enough that she barely had time to register the danger before they closed the distance between the tree line and the road. She ran, instinct driving her legs faster than she had ever moved, but she was no fighter, had never been trained for anything beyond healing hands and careful patience, and the riders gained on her with frightening speed. Ivy reached her first, intercepting the lead rider with a fierce, snarling tackle that bought Wren precious seconds, shouting for her to run toward the settlement while she held the others off. Wren did not need to be told twice, sprinting toward the gathering hall with her heart hammering and her breath tearing at her lungs, but the second rider peeled away from Ivy's fight and pursued her directly, gaining ground with every stride. She did not make it to the settlement. The rider caught her at the edge of the training grounds, and though she fought, clawing and twisting with everything her untrained body could manage, she was no match for a fighter trained specifically for this kind of confrontation, and within moments, she found herself pinned, terrified, while the rider shouted something toward the tree line that she understood, with dawning horror, was a signal meant to reach Silas himself, confirmation that his target had been secured. What none of them anticipated, not Silas's riders, not Wren, not even Ivy still fighting fiercely nearby, was the enormous shape that exploded from the tree line at that exact moment, moving with a speed and ferocity that belonged entirely to instinct rather than thought. Cale had felt the wrongness the moment it began, a sharp, tearing panic that ripped through the quiet bond he had spent 2 weeks trying to suppress, and his wolf had taken over completely, before his human mind fully understood what was happening, covering the miles between Ashwood and Blackthorn, faster than he had ever moved in his life, driven by a single, overwhelming need to reach her before it was too late. He reached the training grounds just as the rider pinning Wren looked up, and whatever composure Cale might have maintained in any other circumstance dissolved entirely at the sight of her, frightened and struggling beneath a stranger's hands. His wolf moved without hesitation, driving the rider back and away from her, with a force that left no question about the outcome, protective fury overriding every careful, calculated instinct Cale had spent years cultivating as a ruler. The remaining riders, seeing their target lost and facing an opponent whose size and rage far exceeded anything they had prepared for, broke off their attack and fled back toward Thorncastle territory, leaving Ivy bruised but victorious over the rider she had held, and leaving Wren shaking on the ground, staring up at the enormous wolf now standing protectively over her, gold eyes searching her face with an intensity that needed no words to explain what he was feeling. Cale shifted back to human form the moment he was certain the immediate danger had passed, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly, as though he did not quite trust himself to touch her gently enough after the violence of the moments before. Wren. Her name came out rough, urgent, stripped of every careful, diplomatic distance he had tried to maintain over the past 2 weeks. "Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice shook, and when she reached for him, gripping his hand tightly, he did not pull away, did not retreat behind formal composure or careful distance. He simply held on, as though he had finally stopped fighting the thing his wolf had known all along. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out before he could organize them into anything more elegant. "For the letter. For pulling away. I told myself I was protecting my kingdom by keeping my distance, and instead, I nearly cost you everything by not being close enough to protect you when it mattered most. I won't make that mistake again, Wren. I don't care what the council thinks is strategically wise. I care about you, and I should have said so weeks ago, instead of hiding behind careful, cowardly letters." Around them, Blackthorn's enforcers gathered, Owen arriving breathless from the settlement to find his king kneeling in the dirt beside a shaken but unharmed Omega healer, gold eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that left no room for doubt about what had driven him to cross such distance so quickly. Whatever careful diplomatic conversations might still need to happen between their two territories, it was clear to everyone watching that the question of whether Cale's bond to Wren was real had been answered, decisively and beyond any argument, in the space of a few terrifying, chaotic minutes. The council chamber had never held so many people at once, word of Thorncastle's attack and Ashwood's king's response spreading fast enough that representatives from both packs crowded the hall alongside Cale's own advisors, all of them waiting to hear how their ruler intended to address what had happened. Cale stood at the head of the table, Wren beside him, her hand steady in his despite the eyes of every advisor and dignitary fixed on them both. Bianca watched with an expression that had shifted, over the past 2 days, from disapproval to something more thoughtful, and even Hugo, always cautious, had softened somewhat, in light of how decisively the danger had been resolved. "I want to address the concerns raised in this chamber honestly," Cale began, his voice carrying the steady authority of a man who had finally stopped second-guessing the decision his heart had already made weeks ago. "You were not wrong to worry about the political costs of this bond. Alliances matter. Strategy matters. I do not dismiss the weight of those concerns simply because my heart has led me somewhere the careful calculations didn't anticipate." He glanced at Wren, and something in his expression softened further before he continued. "But I have learned, over these past weeks, that a kingdom is not strengthened by a king who ignores what is real, in favor of what is merely convenient. Wren was targeted precisely because Silas believed my attachment to her made me vulnerable. He was wrong. It does not make me vulnerable. It makes me certain, in a way 6 years of careful, isolated decision-making never managed to achieve, exactly what I am willing to fight for." Bianca rose slowly from her seat, and for a moment the room held its breath, uncertain whether the older advisor intended to renew her objections or offer something different. "Your Majesty," she said finally, "I have served this crown through your father's reign, and yours, and I have watched you make careful, strategic choices for 6 years, without complaint, because they served this kingdom well. But I have never, in all that time, seen you move as decisively, as fiercely, as you did to protect this woman. Perhaps my calculations failed to account for something that matters more than alliance. I withdraw my objection." A murmur moved through the gathered crowd, surprise and relief mingling in equal measure, and Owen, standing near the back of the chamber, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at how thoroughly the tide had turned, in favor of the bond his own pack had once worried might bring only complication. Cale turned to Wren then, releasing her hand only to take both of hers instead, his expression open in a way she had never seen from him before, none of the careful royal composure remaining, only honest, unguarded certainty. I should have said this properly weeks ago. Instead of hiding behind flowers and silence and midnight visits, I refused to explain, he said. Wren of Blackthorn, I am asking you, in front of my council and yours, to be my mate. Not because my wolf demands it, though he certainly does, but because I have come to know you these past weeks, your strength, your patience, the way you care for people the world too often overlooks, and I want nothing more than to spend the rest of my life making certain you are never overlooked again. Wren felt tears gather, unexpected and warm, as she looked up at him, at the man who had once fled her doorstep in a panic, and now stood before an entire gathered council, unguarded and certain, offering her everything without hesitation. I remember thinking, the first morning I found flattened grass outside my door, that whatever had rested there meant nothing, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I was wrong about that from the very beginning. It meant everything, even before either of us understood what it was. Yes, Kale, I'll be your mate. The chamber erupted into sound, cheers and applause mixing with the formal murmurs of advisors already beginning to discuss what the bond would mean for the alliance between their two territories. But Kale heard none of it clearly, his attention entirely fixed on Wren as he drew her close, the guard duty he had once claimed as an excuse now. Finally, an honest and permanent truth rather than a lie, he told to hide what his heart had already known. In the months that followed, Blackthorn's small healing house grew into something larger, better funded, supported openly by Ashwood's resources, and Wren continued her work there, even as her new position brought responsibilities she had never imagined carrying. The pack that had once overlooked her now spoke her name with pride, and the doorstep where a king's wolf had once rested in secret became, instead, a place he returned to openly, again and again, no longer needing the cover of darkness or the excuse of duty to explain why he could not stay away. Guard duty, he still liked to call it, whenever Wren teased him about those early nights, though both of them understood now that it had never truly been duty at all. It had been, from the very first night his wolf chose her doorstep, out of every doorstep in the world, something far simpler and far more enduring than duty could ever explain. It had been love, quietly waiting to be recognized, patient enough to rest in the grass through countless dark nights, until both of them finally found the courage to see it clearly.